I never expected to find Jesus while trying to pray to Allah outside a Catholic church. But God meets us exactly where we are, not where we think we should be. My name is Ashraf Fahad. I am 29 years old and live in Kuwait City. Growing up in a devout Muslim family, my life was shaped by faith. My father, an Imam at our local mosque, was the spiritual leader of our home. His voice, reciting verses from the Quran, filled the air every day, especially early in the morning, before dawn, when we would wake up for the far prayer. This was the rhythm of my life for as long as I could remember. Every morning, I would perform the ritual washing, followed by the 5 daily prayers that were integral to my spiritual identity. My mother, who wore the hijab with grace, instilled in me the values of charity, modesty, and devotion to Allah. Our home was one where faith was lived, not just practiced. We spread our prayer rugs in the living room, facing Mecca, and the call to prayer echoed through the neighborhood, marking the moments of prayer in our daily lives. For 29 years, I never questioned this way of life. I memorized the Quran in Arabic, attended Friday prayers at the mosque without fail, and observed Ramadan with discipline. I had even gone on the pilgrimage to Mecca when I was 25, a journey that many Muslims dream of. That should have been the pinnacle of my faith. For a time it was. But something shifted in me during the months leading up to October 2023. I began to feel spiritually disconnected. The words I recited during prayer felt hollow, and my mind wandered during moments that should have been devoted to connecting with Allah. My prayers, once a meaningful conversation with the divine, began to feel like mechanical motions. The peace I once felt for my connection to Allah began to dissipate, replaced by a heavy emptiness that I couldn't shake. This emptiness became more pronounced during my evening prayers. I would kneel on the prayer rug in our family's prayer room, facing Mecca, and yet, I felt nothing. The calligraphy of Allah's 99 names hung on the walls, but instead of bringing me peace, it deepened my sense of incompleteness. I began questioning whether Allah was hearing my prayers at all. I felt spiritually lost, disconnected from everything I had believed to be true. My family, especially my father, noticed the change. He encouraged me to spend more time at the mosque, hoping it would rekindle the spark of faith I seemed to be losing. But nothing helped. The more I tried to immerse myself in my faith, the more distant I felt from the spiritual connection I once had. As I continued my daily routine, walking to the factory where I worked as a quality inspector, I passed by a Catholic church near the Al-Mubarakia district. I had walked past it countless times before, but one day, in late September 2023, something changed. It wasn't the church itself, but the presence around it. Something deep within me stirred, urging me to slow down as I passed by. I could feel an energy, something I couldn't describe, pulling me toward the building. I had always been taught that Christians were people of the book, that they had received divine revelation but had corrupted it over time. The idea of stepping foot inside a Christian space was foreign to me, but I found myself inexplicably drawn to it. The church, with its tall steeple and simple cross, radiated a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in months. I tried to rationalize it. It was just a building, I told myself. But the feeling wouldn't go away. Over the next few days, I found myself walking by the church more often. Each time, I felt the pull grow stronger. I couldn't explain it, but I knew that something was changing within me. I felt like I was at a crossroads, unsure of where my faith was leading me. And then, one day, I made a decision that would alter the course of my life forever. The days that followed were filled with internal conflict. I continued to pass by the Catholic Church every morning on my way to work, but now, each time, the feeling grew stronger. It was as if something in the air around the church was calling to me. The sound of the bell ringing from the steeple, the quiet serenity of the building in contrast to the bustling streets of Kuwait City, it all felt so foreign, yet so inviting. I had lived my whole life walking past this church, barely noticing it. Yet now, it felt as though this place was drawing me in, and I couldn't ignore the pull. I tried to push it out of my mind. I told myself I was just tired, that it was simply the stress of work or the spiritual emptiness I had been struggling with. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. There was something about that church, about the stillness I felt around it, that stirred something inside me, a longing I couldn't understand, a yearning for peace that my prayers had failed to fulfill. It had started the previous week when I first noticed the church in the Al-Mubarakia district. I had passed it countless times before, as it was just along my usual route to the office. But something about that building caught my attention more than usual, and I found myself glancing toward it every time I walked by. Maybe it was the way the cross stood tall above the entrance, catching the rays of the afternoon sun. Or perhaps it was the serene feeling that seemed to radiate from the church grounds, especially when I noticed the nuns in their white habits walking across the lawn. At first, I chalked it up to nothing more than a passing curiosity. After all, I had been raised to respect all religions, and as a Muslim, I was accustomed to seeing churches as places where others went to seek their spiritual connection. But the curiosity slowly grew into something more. It became a pull I couldn't ignore, an inexplicable feeling that stirred within me as I passed by. And soon, I found myself slowing down, my feet unconsciously stopping in front of the church as though something within me was urging me to take notice. It wasn't the architecture or the beauty of the building that caught my attention. It was the peace that surrounded it, the stillness in the air, the calm that seemed to fill the space. The more I tried to ignore it, the more I felt the weight of this internal pull. I had no way of explaining it, and in the beginning, I struggled with the idea. My life had always been firmly rooted in Islam, in the traditions and prayers that had been passed down to me through generations. I had never doubted them before. But now, I found myself questioning everything. There was a feeling of restlessness growing within me. The sense of disconnection I had been feeling during my prayers was intensifying, and I could no longer push it away. I began to wonder, was this what I had been searching for all along? Was this church, this peaceful space, offering me something my prayers could no longer provide? The internal conflict was overwhelming. On one hand, I was a devout Muslim, proud of my heritage and upbringing. My father, the Imam, had instilled in me the importance of remaining steadfast in my faith, and his guidance had shaped every aspect of my life. I had memorized verses from the Quran, observed the 5 daily prayers, fasted during Ramadan, and even made the pilgrimage to Mecca. These were the tenets of my life, the foundation of everything I had believed. To even consider stepping outside of those boundaries felt like a betrayal. But on the other hand, the spiritual emptiness I had been experiencing for months had become impossible to ignore. The familiar prayers that had once given me comfort now felt hollow, and the words I recited seemed to carry no weight. I found myself going through the motions, fulfilling the religious obligations out of habit rather than genuine connection. My heart, once full of devotion, now felt empty. One morning, as I walked to work, I found myself standing in front of the church again. The sun was still low in the sky, casting a warm golden hue over the building. I could hear the faint sound of a bell tolling in the distance, marking the beginning of the day. As I stood there, I realized that something had shifted. I wasn't just passing by anymore. I was aware of something greater than myself, something drawing me in, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel so alone. I told myself it was just curiosity, nothing more. But even as I walked away, the feeling lingered. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was a longing. A deep, almost painful longing for spiritual peace. I tried to shake it off, but every step I took seemed to carry me further into confusion. What was happening to me? Why was I feeling this way? The next few days were a blur. I continued with my daily routine, but every time I passed the church, that same feeling would return. It was as though the church had become a magnet, pulling me in without any clear explanation. And each time I stood outside, I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in months, despite the conflict brewing within me. I began researching the church on my phone during my lunch breaks. It was called St. Joseph's Church, established in 1940 by missionaries who had come to Kuwait to spread Christianity. The church had a rich history, offering not only religious services but also community support and outreach programs. The mission of the church was to spread love, peace, and charity, values that resonated deeply with me. But even as I read, I hesitated. I had been taught that the teachings of Islam were the only true path to salvation. I had been taught to respect all religions but to never stray from my own faith. To even consider entering a church felt like I was turning my back on everything I had ever known. My family, my friends, my community they would never understand. I could already imagine the disappointment in my father's eyes if he knew I was even contemplating such a thing. But there was no denying the pull. It was as if my soul was crying out for something more, something that my Islamic practices could no longer provide. I knew I had to do something. I had to find out if the peace I felt outside that church could fill the emptiness that had taken root within me. That decision came on a Tuesday afternoon, just as the sun began to set. I had just finished my work at the office and was walking home when I found myself once again standing in front of St. Joseph's Church. This time, I didn't stop myself. I walked up the steps and stood before the large wooden doors, hesitating for just a moment before reaching for the handle. What was I doing, I asked myself again. But at that moment, I knew that I couldn't turn back. I had to find the answers that had eluded me for so long. My heart raced as I stepped inside. Have you ever felt spiritually homeless, even while surrounded by everything you thought represented truth? That's exactly how I felt during those final weeks of September. My family's faith tradition, which had provided structure and meaning for nearly 3 decades, suddenly felt like an ill-fitting garment I was forcing myself to wear. The mosque that had been my spiritual home now felt like a foreign place where I was merely going through familiar motions without genuine connection. The spiritual crisis deepened when I began having vivid dreams that made no sense within my Islamic worldview. I would dream of bright lights piercing through darkness, of voices speaking words I couldn't understand but somehow felt drawn toward. Upon waking, instead of feeling disturbed by these dreams, I experienced an inexplicable sense of peace that lasted for hours. This confused me tremendously because nothing in my Islamic education had prepared me for such experiences. Family pressures only intensified my internal struggle. My father, noticing my decreased enthusiasm during family prayers, began questioning my commitment to our faith. He suggested I spend more time at the mosque, perhaps volunteer for community service projects that might rekindle my spiritual fire. My mother expressed concern that I was being influenced by secular Western culture at my workplace, urging me to strengthen my Islamic identity by attending additional Quran study sessions. Their well-meaning advice felt like additional weight on my already burdened shoulders. How could I explain to them that the very foundation of our shared faith felt unstable beneath my feet? How could I tell my Imam father that his son was experiencing doubts about Allah's existence, about the authenticity of Muhammad's revelations, about the entire framework of Islamic belief that had shaped our family's identity for generations? The internal conflict became almost unbearable by early October. During the day, I maintained the appearance of faithful observance, joining co-workers for Friday prayers at the small prayer room our plant had designated for Muslim employees. But privately, I was questioning everything from the historical accuracy of the Quran to the theological foundations of Islamic doctrine. These weren't casual intellectual curiosities, but soul-deep questions that demanded answers I couldn't find within my traditional framework. Something about those school grounds called to my troubled spirit in ways that defied rational explanation. The building seemed to radiate a peace I desperately craved but couldn't access through my familiar religious practices. October 3rd, 2023 started like every other Tuesday in my life. I woke at 6:15 a.m. for prayers, performed my ritual washing in the bathroom I shared with my younger brother, and spread my prayer rug facing northeast toward Mecca. The familiar Arabic phrases rolled off my tongue automatically as I went through the prescribed movements of standing, wowing, and prostrating. But even during those early morning moments when the house was quiet and my family still slept, I felt that same spiritual emptiness that had been plaguing me for months. After prayers, I dressed for work in my usual khaki pants and polo shirt, grabbed the lunch my mother had prepared the night before, and began my 20-minute walk to the automotive plant. The October air carried the crisp promise of winter, and fallen leaves crunched beneath my feet as I made my way through the familiar streets of our Detroit neighborhood. For the first 15 minutes of my walk, everything proceeded exactly as it had hundreds of times before. But as I approached the church, that inexplicable pull I had been experiencing for weeks intensified dramatically. Instead of the mild curiosity that usually drew my attention to the building, I felt an overwhelming urge to stop walking entirely. My feet seemed to slow of their own accord as I neared the church. The red brick building with its modest bell tower appeared different somehow, though I couldn't articulate exactly what had changed. The morning sunlight struck the simple cross above the main entrance in a way that made it seem more prominent than usual. I stood on the sidewalk directly in front of the church for several minutes, ostensibly checking my phone for the time, but actually trying to understand why this place commanded such attention from my troubled spirit. Students were arriving for classes, their backpacks bouncing as they hurried through the front doors. The rational part of my mind reminded me that I would be late for work if I didn't continue walking immediately. My supervisor at the plan was particular about equality, and I had already used my allotted sick days earlier in the year when my spiritual crisis had manifested in physical symptoms of anxiety and insomnia. But the spiritual part of me, the part that had felt so empty during months of Islamic prayers, seemed to recognize something sacred about this place. I forced myself to continue walking to work. But throughout my 8-hour shift inspecting automotive parts, my thoughts kept returning to the Catholic Church. During lunch break, instead of joining my Muslim co-workers for the usual conversations about weekend plans and family updates, I found myself researching the school on my phone. The website revealed it had been established in 1952 by some Fathers of Christ dedicated to providing quality Catholic values. As my shift ended at 4:30 p.m., I made a decision that would alter the trajectory of my entire life. Instead of taking my usual route home, I deliberately chose to walk past the Catholic Church again. The afternoon dismissal was on the way, and I watched many worshippers streaming out of the building, their voices creating a joyful symphony that somehow lifted my spirits despite the spiritual darkness I had been carrying for months. Every fiber of my Muslim upbringing told me this was wrong. I had been taught from childhood that Christians were people of the book who had received genuine revelation but had corrupted it over time. The Trinity was considered the greatest sin in Islamic theology because it supposedly compromised the absolute unity of Allah. Seeking spiritual guidance from a Christian institution would be seen as apostasy by my family and community. But my desperate need for authentic spiritual connection overrode these theological concerns. The emptiness in my soul had become so profound that I was willing to risk disapproval, confusion, and even anger from those I loved most. I needed to know whether the peace I sensed emanating from this place could somehow fill the void that Islamic prayer no longer seems to reach. I stopped walking directly in front of the church and reached into my backpack with a small prayer rug I carried everywhere. This rug had been a gift from my grandmother before her death 2 years earlier. Hand-woven in Mexico with intricate geometric patterns in deep blues and golds. It has accompanied me on business trips, camping excursions, and every significant journey of my adult life. Rolling it on the public sidewalk outside a Catholic church felt like both a betrayal of my heritage and a desperate plea for divine intervention. The decision to spread my prayer rug on that sidewalk represented more than just finding a convenient place to fulfill my religious obligations. It was an unconscious admission that my traditional Islamic framework was no longer providing the spiritual sustenance my soul craved. I was essentially placing myself at the intersection of two faith traditions, hoping that somehow in that liminal space, I might discover the authentic connection with the divine that had been eluding me for months. I positioned my prayer rug carefully, ensuring it faced northeast toward Mecca according to the compass app on my phone. The weight of the decision I had made settled on my shoulders, but there was no turning back now. My feet were planted firmly on the ground, but my heart raced with uncertainty. The familiar words of the Maghrib prayer were already forming on my lips, but there was an uneasiness deep within me, one I couldn't quite place. My life, my faith, everything I had known seemed to be shifting with every movement. The sidewalk under my knees felt different than I expected. It wasn't the cold concrete or the hard surface that bothered me, but rather the odd warmth radiating from the ground. It didn't make sense. The sun had set, the evening air was cool, but there was a subtle warmth, like something stirring beneath the surface, that seemed to reach up through my prayer rug. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the words I would recite. As I began the prayer, I took a deep breath, trying to center my thoughts. Allahu Akbar, I whispered, lifting my hands toward the sky. The Arabic words came out almost automatically, but there was a hesitation in my heart, something that had never been there before. The prayer felt different. The words, which had once been a powerful connection to Allah, now seemed like mere echoes. My mind kept drifting, not to the thoughts I usually wrestled with, but to the church behind me. What was I doing here? What was this peace I felt? And why was it coming from a place that had always been considered forbidden? I quickly shook my head. There was no time for such thoughts. I had to finish my prayer. Instead of the disapproval or confusion I expected, she simply observed me with what appeared to be respectful curiosity, maintaining a polite distance that honored my religious practice while clearly remaining available if needed. This unexpected gesture of interfaith respect should have put me at ease, but instead it heightened my awareness that something significant was about to occur. I began my prayer with the familiar words I had recited thousands of times before. But from the very first phrase, everything felt different in ways I couldn't yet comprehend. As I knelt on my prayer rug and began reciting the opening verses of the Maghrib prayer, I immediately sensed that something was fundamentally different about this moment. The familiar Arabic words that usually flowed automatically from my lips felt heavy and strange, as if I were speaking a foreign language for the first time. My voice wavered slightly as I recited Allahu Akbar, and instead of the mechanical comfort I had grown accustomed to during months of spiritually empty prayers, I felt an electric tension in the air around me. The concrete sidewalk beneath my prayer rug began to feel unusually warm against my knees. At first, I attributed this sensation to the afternoon sun that had been heating the pavement throughout the day. But as I continued through the prescribed movement of Islamic prayer, the warmth intensified in a way that defied logical explanation. It wasn't the surface heat you might expect from sun-baked concrete, but rather a deep penetrating warmth that seemed to rise from somewhere far beneath the ground. As I moved into the position of frustration, placing my forehead against the rug in submission to Allah, the warmth spread through my entire body. My hands pressed flat against a prayer rug began to tingle with an energy I had never experienced before. The sensation wasn't uncomfortable, but it was so unusual and intense that I found it impossible to concentrate on the Arabic prayers I was supposed to be reciting. Instead of feeling the spiritual connection to Allah that frustration was meant to facilitate, I felt as if some other presence was trying to communicate with me through these physical sensations. When I lifted my head from frustration and looked up toward the sky, what I saw defied every expectation I had about how the natural world operates. The afternoon sky had been overcast when I began my prayer with thick gray clouds that seemed to promise rain before evening. But as I gazed upward, those same clouds were parting in a way that appeared completely unnatural. It wasn't the gradual shifting you normally see as weather patterns change, but rather a deliberate separation that revealed brilliant sunlight behind the gray cover. The sunlight that broke through the parted clouds wasn't diffused or scattered as you would expect from normal atmospheric conditions. Instead, it formed a concentrated beam of golden light that descended directly toward the school grounds. As I watched in complete amazement, this beam of light arranged itself into an unmistakable crook shape directly above the Catholic Church. The vertical beam extended from the clouds down to the chapel roof, while the horizontal beam spread across the widths of the school building. My hands began trembling uncontrollably as I witnessed this phenomenon. The prayer beads I had been holding slipped from my fingers and scattered across the concrete sidewalk. Every rational part of my mind tried to find a logical explanation for what I was seeing. Perhaps it was an unusual refraction of sunlight through the clouds. Or maybe my spiritual distress was causing me to hallucinate. But the physical sensations I was experiencing, the warmth beneath me and the trembling in my hands, felt entirely real and undeniable. I attempted to continue with my prayer to complete the prescribed verses and movements that constituted proper Islamic worship, but my voice caught in my throat, and the Arabic words that had been second nature to me since childhood simply wouldn't come. It felt as if some invisible force was preventing me from completing my Islamic prayer. While this extraordinary display was occurring above the Catholic Church, the spiritual conflict was so intense that I began to feel physically ill. At that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that Allah wasn't the one calling me to this place. The realization struck me like a physical blow, challenging everything I had believed about my identity, my family's faith, and my understanding of divine truth. For 29 years, I had believed that Allah was the one true God and that Islamic prayer was the only acceptable form of worship. But the presence I felt surrounding me as that cross of light blazed above the Catholic chapel was entirely different from anything I had experienced during decades of Islamic devotion. The nun, who had been observing my prayer from a respectful distance near the school entrance, suddenly gasped audibly and pointed upward toward the sky. Her reaction confirmed that I wasn't imagining or hallucinating what I was seeing. This Catholic nun, who had no reason to validate my spiritual experience, was witnessing the same extraordinary phenomenon that was completely overwhelming my senses and challenging my theological worldview. The cross of light remained visible for exactly 30 seconds, though it felt like an eternity as I knelt there paralyzed by awe and terror. During those 30 seconds, I felt more spiritually alive than I had during months of Islamic prayer and study. The emptiness that had plagued my soul for so long was suddenly filled with a presence so loving and powerful that I began weeping uncontrollably. These weren't tears of sadness or fear, but rather tears of recognition, as if my spirit was acknowledging something it had been searching for without knowing what it was seeking. When the clouds shifted back together and the cross of light disappeared, I was left kneeling on my prayer rug in a state of complete spiritual upheaval. The warmth beneath me gradually subsided, but the trembling in my hands continued for several more minutes. I felt as if I had been touched by something divine, something far beyond my understanding or control. The Islamic prayers I had been attempting to recite seemed not just incomplete, but entirely inappropriate for what had just occurred. I began packing up my prayer rug with shaking hands, my movements clumsy and uncertain. I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't think much of it at first, but then I heard a soft, almost reverent voice. "Are you okay?" I froze mid-prayer, my forehead still pressed against the prayer rug. The voice wasn't harsh or judgmental. It was calm, gentle, curious, even. I slowly lifted my head, startled. In the doorway of the church stood a Catholic sister, dressed in the traditional habit. She wasn't standing with any sense of authority or disapproval. Instead, she appeared to be quietly observing. I wasn't sure what to say. I had always been taught to avoid situations like this. My faith had taught me that there were boundaries between religions, lines that should not be crossed. But in that moment, it wasn't just the fact that I was praying outside a church that startled me, it was the way she stood there, not judging, not dismissing, but quietly curious. "I'm sorry if I've caused any offense," I said, my voice low but respectful. I was still on my knees, my hands trembling slightly as I tried to finish my prayer. I had to pray, and this is the only place I could find. The sister didn't move, but her expression softened. "No offense," she said gently. "I was just wondering if you needed anything. You look like you've seen something that's shaken you deeply." Her acknowledgement that something extraordinary had occurred validated my experience in a way that made me feel less alone in my confusion. Instead of dismissing what had happened or offering quick explanations, she simply recognized that I was in the midst of a profound spiritual encounter. Instead of the fear or defensive anger that every Muslim instinct told me I should feel toward a Christian religious figure, I experienced an inexplicable sense of peace in her presence. Standing there on that sidewalk with my prayer rug tucked under my arm and my understanding of divine truths completely shattered, I felt safer with this Catholic sister than I had felt anywhere in months. Her very presence seemed to emanate the same loving energy I had experienced during those 30 seconds when the cross of light blazed above the chapel. "I don't know what just happened," I managed to say, my voice still shaking from the intensity of what I had witnessed. "I was trying to pray, and then the sky opened up, and there was this light shaped like a cross, and I couldn't finish my prayers, and I don't understand any of it." The words stumbled out of me in a rush, as if speaking them quickly might help me make sense of the impossible thing I had just experienced. She nodded with a knowing expression that suggested she understood the significance of what had occurred far better than I did. "Sometimes God speaks to us in ways we don't expect," she said simply. "Sometimes He calls us to places we never imagined we'd go. Would you like to come inside for some tea? I think you could use a quiet place to sit and process what just happened." Every part of my Islamic upbringing screamed that I should decline her invitation immediately. Entering a Christian religious building would be seen as a form of spiritual betrayal by my family and community. The walls would be covered with images and symbols that my faith had taught me to view as idolatrous. I would be surrounded by representations of the Trinity, which Islamic theology considers the greatest possible sin against Allah's unity and sovereignty. But something deeper than theological training urged me to accept her invitation. The spiritual hunger that had been gnawing at my soul for months recognized that this sister possessed something I desperately needed. The peace radiating from her presence offered the possibility of answers to questions I had been afraid to ask. My spirit, which had felt so empty during Islamic prayers, suddenly felt drawn toward whatever truth this Catholic woman might be able to share. "I would like that very much," I heard myself saying, surprised by my own words. "I think I need to understand what just happened, and I don't think I can figure it out on my own." The nun led into the church, and instead of feeling uncomfortable in its presence, I found myself drawn to examine it more closely. The figure of Jesus, arms outstretched in sacrificial love, seemed to embody the same peaceful energy I had been sensing from her. She poured tea from a simple ceramic pot and offered me a seat in one of the chairs. The normality of sharing tea with another human being helped ground me after the extraordinary supernatural experience I had just witnessed. As I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, I realized this was the first genuine peace I had felt in months. "Tell me about yourself," the nun said, settling into her own chair with the patient demeanor of someone accustomed to listening to troubled souls. "What brought you to pray outside our school today?" Her question was gentle but direct, inviting me to share as much or as little as I felt comfortable revealing. I found myself opening up to this Catholic nun in ways I had never been able to with my family, friends, or even my father who served as an imam at our mosque. I told her about my lifelong Islamic faith, about the spiritual emptiness that had been consuming me for months, about the inexplicable attraction I had been feeling toward the school grounds. I described my growing doubts about Islamic prayer and theology, fears I had never been able to voice to anyone in my Muslim community. She listened without interruption, her face reflecting compassion rather than judgment as I confessed my spiritual struggles. When I finished speaking, she was quiet for several moments, as if carefully considering how to respond to the crisis of faith I had just described. "Hussein," she said, using my name with a respect that surprised me, "I believe what happened outside today was Jesus calling you to himself. You've been searching for authentic connection with God, and he's been preparing your heart to receive his love in a new way." Her words pierced through the confusion in my mind like a beam of clarity. She continued, "Jesus doesn't want to take away your faith. He wants to fulfill it. Everything you've been seeking through Islamic prayer, everything your soul has been hungry for can be found in a personal relationship with Christ." The way she spoke about Jesus wasn't academic or theological, but deeply personal, as if she was describing someone she knew intimately. For the first time in months, the spiritual emptiness that had been consuming my soul began to fill with something I could only describe as hope. Sitting in the church, surrounded by crucifixes and images that my Islamic upbringing had taught me to fear, I felt an overwhelming sense of spiritual clarity that had been absent from my life for months. The words she had spoken about Jesus fulfilling rather than replacing my faith resonated in my heart with a truth I could no longer deny. Everything I had been searching for through Islamic prayer, every spiritual hunger that had driven me to desperation seemed to find its answer in this church. "I want to know Jesus," I heard myself saying, the words emerging from a place deeper than conscious thought. "I don't understand what happened out there today, but I know it was real, and I know it was him calling me." As those words left my lips, I felt a weight that I hadn't even realized I was carrying begin to lift from my shoulders. The spiritual burden that had made every Islamic prayer feel hollow and meaningless suddenly dissolved. The nun smiled with the joy of someone who had witnessed countless encounters between searching souls and divine grace. "Would you like to pray with me right now?" he asked gently. Not an Islamic prayer or a Catholic ritual, but just a simple conversation with Jesus, asking him to reveal himself to you personally. The invitation felt both terrifying and irresistible, like standing at the edge of a cliff and being invited to trust that there were wings waiting to carry me safely to the other side. Right there in that office with my back turned to Mecca for the first time in my adult life, I bowed my head and asked Jesus Christ to show me who he truly was. The prayer that came from my heart was unlike any religious recitation I had ever performed. Instead of formal Arabic phrases prescribed by Islamic law, I found myself speaking directly to Jesus in my own words, pouring out months of spiritual frustration and desperate longing for authentic connection with the divine. "Jesus," I prayed, my voice breaking with emotion, "if you're real, if you're the one who created that cross of light above this school, please help me understand what you want from me. I've been so empty for so long, and nothing in my Islamic faith has been able to fill that emptiness. If you can give me the peace I've been searching for, I want to follow you." As I spoke those words, something extraordinary happened inside my chest. The crushing weight of spiritual emptiness that had been my constant companion for months suddenly lifted completely. It felt as if invisible chains that had been binding my soul were breaking away one by one. A warmth that had nothing to do with temperature spread through my entire body, starting from my heart and radiating outward until every cell seemed to be filled with divine love. She placed a gentle hand on my shoulder as I wept tears of relief and overwhelming gratitude. "Welcome to the family of God," she whispered. Jesus has been calling you for months, preparing your heart for this moment. Everything you've been through, all the emptiness and searching was leading you to this encounter with His love. The transformation was immediate and undeniable. The God I had been trying to reach through Islamic prayer for 29 years suddenly felt closer than my own heartbeat. That Jesus I had been taught to view as merely a prophet had revealed Himself as the living Son of God who loved me personally and intimately. Every prayer I had ever offered, every spiritual hunger I had ever experienced had found its ultimate fulfillment in this moment of surrender to Christ. The nun spent the next hour explaining the basics of Christian faith, but not in the academic way I might have expected from a religious teacher. Instead, she spoke about Jesus as if describing a beloved friend, sharing stories from the Gospels that illustrated His compassion, His sacrifice, and His desire for personal relationship with every human being. Each story she told seemed to address specific doubts and questions that had been troubling my heart during my months of spiritual crisis. What happens now? I suddenly aware that accepting Jesus as my Lord and Savior would have profound implications for every aspect of my life. My family, my community, my identity as Hussein, the faithful Muslim son, would all be challenged by this decision. The courage I felt in her presence might not sustain me when I faced the inevitable opposition from those I love most. "Now you begin the most beautiful journey of your life," she replied with confidence born from years of shepherding new believers through their first steps of faith. "It won't always be easy, especially given your family background, but Jesus will never leave you or abandon you. You're not walking this path alone." She connected me with Father Rodriguez, the parish priest, who would be able to provide guidance about baptism and formal entry into the Catholic Church. The conversation about telling my family was the most difficult part of that entire afternoon. Sister Catherine helped me understand that my conversion to Christianity would likely be viewed as betrayal by my parents and siblings who had invested decades in raising me within Islamic faith. My father's position as an Imam would make my decision particularly painful for the family, potentially affecting his standing within our mosque community. "Pray before you tell them," she advised. "Ask Jesus to prepare their hearts and give you the right words. Remember that your family loves you, even if they can't understand or accept your decision immediately. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is remain faithful to truth even when it's costly." Her wisdom came from years of counseling converts who had faced similar family crises. Look inside your own heart right now and ask yourself whether you've ever faced a decision that required choosing between family approval and spiritual truth. That's exactly the crossroads where I found myself as I prepared to leave that evening. The joy of finding authentic relationship with Jesus was tempered by the knowledge that this discovery would likely cost me relationships with the people who had shaped my entire identity. But as I walked home through the familiar streets of Kuwait, carrying my prayer rug and my completely transformed understanding of divine truth, I knew with absolute certainty that I could never go back to the spiritual emptiness I had endured for months. Jesus had filled the void in my soul that Islamic prayer had been unable to touch, and no amount of family pressure could make me pretend that hadn't happened. The most difficult conversation of my life was waiting for me at home. I stood in the same baptismal pool where countless others had publicly declared their faith in Jesus Christ. The warm water reached my waist as Father Rodriguez prepared to lower me beneath the surface, symbolically burying my old life as a Muslim and raising me as a new creation in Christ. The nun stood at the edge of the pool, tears of joy streaming down her face as she witnessed the completion of the spiritual journey that had begun with our conversation in her office. The path from that October afternoon to my baptism had been the most challenging and rewarding 3 months of my entire life. Telling my family about my conversion to Christianity was indeed the most difficult conversation I had ever faced. I chose to speak with my parents first, sitting in our living room where we had shared thousands of family prayers throughout my childhood. The same prayer rugs that had been my connection to Islamic faith for nearly 3 decades were spread across the floor as I prepared to shatter everything my family believed about my spiritual identity. "I need to tell you something that's going to be very hard for you to hear." I began, my voice trembling despite the peace Jesus had given me about this decision. "I've become a Christian. I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and I've accepted Him as my Lord and Savior." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode, and the silence that followed felt like an eternity. My father's reaction was exactly what I had feared. His face went through a series of expressions ranging from confusion to disbelief to profound grief. As an imam who had dedicated his life to Islamic teaching, My conversion represented not just a personal betrayal but a fundamental challenge to everything he had invested his identity in. "How could you abandon Allah?" he asked, his voice broken with a pain I had never heard before. "How could you commit church by worshipping a man as God?" My mother's response was even more devastating because it was quieter. She simply began weeping. The kind of deep silent sobs that come from a mother who feels she has lost her child. For her, my conversion meant that we would no longer share the same eternal destiny, that the son she had raised in Islamic faith was now walking a path she believed that led to damnation. The theological implications were too overwhelming for her to process rationally. My 3 sisters reacted with a mixture of anger, confusion, and desperate attempts to convince me that I was making a temporary mistake that could be corrected through more intensive Islamic study. They suggested I was having a mental health crisis, that the stress of work had somehow made me vulnerable to Christian manipulation. Their inability to accept that I had made a rational, spiritually informed decision was heartbreaking, but not unexpected. The conversation lasted for hours, with my family members taking turns trying to convince me to reconsider what they saw as a catastrophic decision. They quoted verses from the Quran, reminded me of my Islamic heritage, and pleaded with me to speak with our Imam about returning to proper faith. But nothing they said could erase the spiritual transformation I had experienced or the peace that Jesus had brought to my previously empty soul. Some friends in our Muslim community abandoned me immediately when news of my conversion spread. A few friends became genuinely curious about what had motivated such a dramatic change in someone they had known to be a sincere and thoughtful Muslim. These conversations gave me opportunities to share my testimony and explain how Jesus had filled the spiritual emptiness that Islamic prayer had been unable to address. While most of these friends didn't convert themselves, some began asking deeper questions about the nature of divine truth. The most devastating consequence was losing my job at the Muslim Community Center, where I had been working part-time as a youth coordinator. When the director learned about my conversion, he called me into his office and explained that my position was no longer tenable given my new religious identity. "You understand that we can't have someone teaching Muslim youth who has rejected Islam," he said with obvious sadness. "It would be confusing and potentially harmful for the children." I understood his position, even as it created serious financial challenges for me. The community center had been more than just employment. It had been a place where I felt connected to my cultural heritage and able to contribute meaningfully to younger generations. Losing that connection forced me to confront how thoroughly my conversion had separated me from the Islamic community that had shaped my entire social identity. The spiritual hunger that had driven me to desperation was completely satisfied by my relationship with Christ. Father Rodriguez became an invaluable mentor during this transition period, meeting with me weekly to study the Bible and answering the countless questions that arose as I learned to understand Christian theology. His patience with my Islamic background and his deep knowledge of both faiths helped me navigate the theological complexities of my conversion. Through his guidance, I began to see how my Islamic heritage had actually prepared my heart for receiving Christ in ways I hadn't recognized. 4 months after my conversion, I was baptized as Father Rodriguez raised me from the baptismal water. I felt the same divine presence that had first called me through the cross of light above the school. The congregation erupted in applause and praise, welcoming me into the family of God with a joy that helped heal some of the relational wounds my conversion had created. Today, I serve as a bridge between Muslim and Christian communities in my town, helping both groups understand each other better while sharing my testimony of how Jesus revealed himself to a searching Muslim heart. My family relationships are slowly healing as they witness the positive changes that faith in Christ has brought to my life. Some of my siblings have even begun asking questions about my faith, though none have converted yet. If you're struggling with spiritual emptiness, if you're searching for authentic connection with the divine, I have never been more certain of God's love than I am right now. If this testimony has touched your heart in any way, I invite you to seek Jesus for yourself and discover the peace that can only be found in him.